Good evening and welcome, and on behalf of the Westphal College of Media Arts and Design and the Department of Architecture and Design and Urbanism, it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to the first of this year's Arfaa lectures. My name is Ulrike Altenmüller-Lewis, and I am the head of the Department of Architecture, Design and Urbanism. Drexel's endowed Farajola and Mariam Bardi Arfaa lecture series was established in 1992 by Peter Arfaa and named in honor of his parents. Peter Arfaa had a long and distinguished career as an architect and educator here in Philadelphia. Having studied history and architecture at the University of Pennsylvania, Mr. Arfaa joined the architecture faculty at Drexel University in 1972. Here he taught for 39 years, serving as architecture department head from 1976 to 1985, and we know what happened then. Hello, Paul. I'm happy to see you here. The ongoing Arfaa lecture series, which turned 30 last year, brings design professionals and scholars of the built environment to our campus several times each year. Each fall, winter, and spring quarter, these public presentations consider contemporary, historic, professional, and theoretical aspects of architecture, interior design, and urbanism. The Arfaa lectures give us a chance to introduce the Drexel community and the greater Philadelphia audience to issues of local, national, and global relevance. They are a highlight of our academic year. I would like to introduce you to Dr. Daniel Koslett, assistant professor and architectural historian in my department. Dr. Koslett had taken over the organization of the lecture series last year, and since then, he has worked with the communications team of Westphal College of Media Arts and Design to create a better platform for the architecture lectures. So if you watch closely and if you see the invites that you are getting into your inbox, we now have a terrific website listing the 90 speakers who honored us with their wisdom over the last 30 years. And you will see that with the lecture of our very beloved Dr. Mark Brack, Daniel's predecessor, we are also now making recordings available of lectures moving forward. There's also the new thing that we asked you to register. The lectures will remain free of charge and open to the public. However, the colleges would like to know how many of you attend. But you have heard plenty of me now. And Daniel, please join me up here and let the audience know what you have in store for the rest of the year and introduce our speaker, Henry Grabar.
All right. Thank you, Ulrike. Hello, everyone, and welcome. It's great to see so many of you here. I know you are here for Henry Grabar, and I will introduce him in a moment, but before jumping into the presentation, I just want to make everyone aware of the other two lectures already scheduled for you in this, our 31st year of the Arfaa lecture series. Our winter term lecture, entitled On the Bright Side, Light for Health and the Environment, will be by Professor Jae-Young Suk from the Department of Design at the University of California, Davis. And our spring speaker will be Vishaan Chakrabarti, founder of Practice for Architecture and Urbanism in New York City. His presentation will be The Architecture of Urbanity, Designing for Nature, Culture, and Joy. We hope to see you all here, joining us for those presentations on January 13th and May 1st, respectively. So, as you know, of course, tonight we have our first presentation to be followed by a quick, or not so quick, depending on how people feel, question and answer session with the audience. And just a note, students in our evening architecture classes, you should stick around for this lecture and the question and answer session. We have alerted and worked with the evening architecture professors. They know that you are here and participating, and they understand, and they are expecting you late. So don't worry, you don't need to get up and run away. You are welcome to stay and enjoy the entirety of tonight's program. So please enjoy. All right, now. The clicker is not advancing. There we go. All right. It's a little sensitive. You've got to push hard there, Henry. Okay. All right. So our speaker for tonight as you know, is Henry Grabar. Henry is a journalist, author, and researcher who works on cities, housing, transportation, and the environment. Since 2016, he has been writing the Metropolis column for Slate, and his work has also been published in Architect, The Atlantic, The Guardian, Harper's, The New York Times, The Wall Street Journal, and other outlets. He's also produced podcasts for Decoder Ring, 99% Invisible, and What Next? Our guest edited The Future of Transportation, an anthology, in 2019. And last year, he authored Paved Paradise, How Parking Explains the World, with Penguin Press, a compelling book said by a reviewer at The New Yorker to be, quote, consistently entertaining and often downright funny. So he has received the Richard Rogers Fellowship from Harvard University Graduate School of Design, where he was the 2024 Loeb Fellow. So I will say, as a dedicated walker and SEPTA user myself who does not own a car, it is possible for all of you. I was particularly interested in Henry's work on parking and transit, as well as his earlier work on architecture and planning in post-colonial Algeria. It was therefore wonderful news when he accepted our invitation to present this first Arfaa lecture. We are truly very lucky and quite thrilled to have such an accomplished writer with us here at Drexel to share his thoughts and to hopefully inspire our own. So, tonight's presentation is entitled The Perfect Spot, How the Pursuit of Parking Shapes Our World. And without further ado, Henry, welcome. The podium is yours. There we go. Good luck. Yeah, this seems a little sticky, but it does work out. All right, thank you.
Good evening. I talked to a city council person's staff member a few years ago in Chicago who told me that if you want to get out of a community meeting alive, you must absolutely avoid two topics, and those topics are rats and parking. So, putting my life in your hands tonight, I want to start by quoting Donald Shoup, who is the godfather of parking studies. And Donald Shoup likes to say that thinking about parking takes place in the reptilian cortex of the brain, which is the part of the brain said to govern territoriality, aggression, and ritual display. And I think cognitive science has moved on from this concept of the reptilian cortex, but I think most of us have experienced that this emotional pull exists for us when we experience parking, when we try to hold on to a parking spot, whether that's in our home driveway or at a university or a hospital, at an employer, or in front of a local business. We are fiercely attached to our parking spots, even if our possession of them is only momentary until the next time we move the car. And in fact, we are so parking-brained as a nation that when the President of the United States argued that the G7 conference should be held at his Miami area Doral resort, the first justification he gave was, there is ample parking. It wasn't enough, but nevertheless. So, you get a neat illustration of this concept in parts of the country where it snows. You know this well as Philadelphians, but many cities, including this one, have a practice of saving parking spots by putting various objects in them. And there's a blog in Chicago that catalogs the fantastic array of things that people put out in front of their house once they've shoveled out a parking spot to illustrate that it's theirs and that they intend to hold on to it. And this includes things like machinery and nativity figurines and picnic chairs and what have you. And I've always imagined that the implication of these objects is that you would be beaten with the object in question if you were to take that parking space. And I've never put that to the test, but that's my hunch. And it's hard to imagine another domain, think about this, where the city government is implicitly endorsing vigilante justice as a method of doling out property. But that's exactly what dibs or savesies or whatever, there's a different name for it in every city, That's exactly what this practice is. And in Boston, where I live now, the mayor tried to limit this practice to just 48 hours after a snowfall, and a member of the city council objected. And he said, the issue speaks to the basic principle of what it means to be an American. He said, like the gold miner and the pioneers, residents have a right to stake their claims. So, tonight, I submit to you that the pursuit of a good parking space has become the primary determinant of this country's architecture, urbanism, and environment. Now, what do I mean by good? I mean this parking space must be convenient, available, and free. Convenient meaning, ideally, it's no more than 10 steps from the business that you would like to go into or from your front door. Available meaning it is there for you the moment that you arrive and you can pull right into it. And of course, free. Now this is a trilemma, which means it's very hard to achieve all three of these objectives in a parking space, convenient, available, and free, without destroying the very place that you came to park at in the first place. You can probably imagine many places in your community that fulfill two of these three objectives, but getting all three is awfully hard. And yet this expectation that every parking spot be convenient, available, and free has poisoned our ability to manage this resource in a more sensible way. The preoccupation with parking is often the first objection raised at the prospect of a new business or some new neighbors. And this parking concern freezes our urban geography and pushes new development into sprawl on the urban fringe because people are concerned with the parking supply in their neighborhood. And in response to this demand, we have codes on the books in almost every American city that make it illegal to build homes, offices, or shops without parking, in statutes typically known as parking minimums or parking requirements. This obsession with parking has made housing more expensive. It has turned our buildings uglier, damaged our environment. It has destroyed walkable neighborhoods, and it has made some American downtowns more than half parking by land area. And it has turned our landscapes from something that looks like this or that into something that looks more like this or that. Landscapes you'll all be very familiar with. Now, why have we become dependent on the automobile for even our most basic tasks? Well, I'll argue to you tonight that it's because of these mistakes we have made in our quest to store it. This need to store the automobile has eaten up the public right-of-way and private property alike. Now, don't get me wrong. Everyone loves a good parking space, myself included. But there are things we love more about our cities. There are things we want more than parking. Affordable housing, attractive architecture, walkable neighborhoods, conservation of natural land, and a more sustainable way of life. And what I wish to suggest to you tonight is that the preoccupation with parking, which we all share, preoccupation with this perfect parking spot, is directly impairing our ability to provide these things, to build the city and the society that we actually want, even more than we want that parking space. So how did we get here? The parking problem is as old as the road itself, but it gets a lot more complicated after the invention of the automobile. Americans' enthusiasm for this new mode of transport is immediate and overwhelming. In 1920s Muncie, Indiana, one woman speaks for a nation when she says she bought a car before she installed indoor plumbing because, quote, you can't go to town in a bathtub. And what followed were 4 decades of intense traffic jams as cars swarmed downtown streets. Observers believed that the root of the traffic problem was parking, because a large share of the traffic was caused by people looking for parking, and another share was caused by people giving up on double or even triple parking. And so, by the end of World War II, everyone was convinced that parking was a crisis. Not just a crisis, but in some cases, the crisis. If you look at this cartoon, this is from the Los Angeles Times in 1945, and the little flag that's pinned behind this King Kong-like figure hulking over downtown Los Angeles is labeled the downtown parking problem. And indeed, in a post-war report on decentralization, the flow of people, money, and businesses to the suburbs, the Urban Land Institute, the National Organization of Real Estate Developers, argued that parking was, quote, the most important single problem facing the central business districts of large cities today. And when you think back to the American city in the 1950s and all the problems that we faced as a society, it's shocking to me that people thought parking was the number one issue. But they did. And in fact, they even had their kids trying to figure this out with this little game. Can't imagine why this one hasn't become a classic. And they dealt with this problem. Oh yes, most communities, large and small, chose to focus on increasing the parking supply. And they used urban renewal policies to create parking lots and garages. They built public lots and garages. They made a seismic change to American building practices, requiring every single building to have its own parking supply. And they felt they had to, because the cost of building the parking was higher than the public's willingness to pay. And so the private sector was never going to solve this problem on its own. And lest you think, by the way, that this cartoon represents artistic license, here is an actual before and after aerial photo of Denver, before and after the necessary parking was provided to facilitate trips into the downtown. So, job well done. And here's after those urban renewal projects reached their final use. And that's what it looked like at ground level. Now you can sort of understand what planners were thinking when they established these rules requiring all this parking. Because they could have the private sector fix the parking problem. They could force developers to do it. Instead of using city tax dollars to fund tax-exempt garages or risk the alienation of suburbanites with parking meters, developers would build the parking themselves. And so nearly every city adopted a long and complex code that dictated how many parking spots had to accompany every single use, from apartment buildings and schools to donut shops, nunneries, nail salons, funeral homes. If you can think of something that could be built, it is in the parking guide with a certain number of parking spaces prescribed. And they really are that specific. Here's an example. This thing's like 1,000 pages long. So if any of you are thinking about becoming urban planners, you have this to look forward to. This kind of micromanagement of parking is typical of American city codes. They require acres of parking corresponding to uses as specific as wastewater treatment plants and adult bookstores. Of course, planners do not actually know that an adult bookstore, to take one frequent entry in these rule books, requires 4, 6, or 8 parking spots. How many people will drive to the adult bookstore depends on urban context. But parking planners have made context irrelevant in their building designs and in ours. Now I'm going to run through some of the consequences of this misguided approach to parking in a moment, but let us first admit, when it comes to creating space to park, these laws worked wonders. They created so much parking that few Americans pay to park at home or at work, and fewer still spend more than a few seconds finding a spot, President company accepted. They established suburban parking standards in almost every city in the country. For example, in Los Angeles County, which you see on the right, there are 19 million parking spots. That's 5 for every single household. 14% of the incorporated land in the county is here represented by this blue box. That's more land than the moving lanes on the streets and the freeways put together. In Silicon Valley, the wealthiest region of the United States, parking is 13% of the land. There are 15 million parking spots in the Bay Area, which is enough to wrap a parking lane around the earth twice. And the smaller the city, the more parking there is. Seattle has 5 spaces per household, Des Moines has 20 per household, and pure parking parcels make up 28% of land in Louisville, 37% of downtown Columbia, South Carolina. And by the way, this doesn't include the parking that's inside buildings or at the curb. So with all due respect to Philadelphia, this is what a real parking problem looks like. Now, as a result of these codes, we have built more than enough parking as a nation. We've built at least 3 parking spaces for every car in the United States. And of course, not all those cars are parked at the same time. Some of them are in motion. So even in neighborhoods that claim to toil under a parking shortage, there are usually 45% more spaces than necessary to accommodate peak parking demand. And Philadelphia is no exception here. You can see here on the right a pie chart of where Philadelphia's parking spots are located and how the number of parking spaces per acre corresponds to the number of homes per acre and the number of jobs per acre. And this is organized, Philadelphia split into deciles here according to density of these various characteristics. But you can see that there is often more parking than homes in almost every quadrant of the city. And in total, there are 3.7 parking spaces for every household in Philadelphia. So, forcing the private sector to take care of car storage had some unpleasant and unforeseen side effects. And this is for three reasons: cost, space, and law. First, let's talk about the cost of building parking. These mid-century visions of every house, every apartment building, every shop, every office coming with its own parking supply might have worked out if parking wasn't so damn expensive to build. A stall in a Philadelphia garage costs $32,000 minimum. And even a surface parking lot can cost $5,000 per space to build and maintain. Maintaining the road network, including the aisles of mostly free parking along every street, that costs money too. And you don't think you pay for all this parking, but you do. You pay for it in your tax bill, or you pay for it in the receipt at a store that has a giant mandatory parking lot in front of the front door. So for example of this, I visited a project in Austin, Texas that had been built for formerly homeless veterans. And they had to build a parking space for every single unit in this building. And I went to visit, and all the parking was almost all empty. And this is no surprise. These are people who had been living literally on the sidewalk. And the city had paid, or a nonprofit had paid, to build these houses for them. But they'd been forced to spend 20% of the budget on the whole project on building this giant empty garage. And in that case, every dollar that went into pouring that asphalt was a dollar that would otherwise have gone into providing a house for someone living on the street. So this trade-off between parking and housing can be very real. For low-income housing in California, structured parking accounts for more than a quarter of the cost of the building. And if you don't drive, you're paying for the parking anyway for those who do. After cost, I want to talk about space. A parking spot is typically thought to be 300 square feet with ingress and egress, so nearly the size of a small studio apartment. On a small lot, a developer won't even have room to build the parking required for a multifamily building, even if she could afford it. And furthermore, architects often operate within strict zoning envelopes that dictate how large a building can be. And so more parking literally takes the place of housing in spatial terms as well as financial terms. And then finally, parking spaces are like eggs. You can't build just one. To unlock economies of scale, parking has to be built floor by floor. And then finally, let's talk about these laws. Parking mandates require builders to build for the maximum amount of drivers who might ever show up. Those are separated by different uses by design, so that a store has its own parking, an apartment building has its own parking, and an office has its own parking, even if those parking lots are used at different times of day. And what that means is that parking is there's built to be too much parking by design. That is very much the intention of these laws. And you can see a little demonstration of this with this graphic that contrasts the space required for 2 parking spaces with the size of a 2-bedroom apartment. The space required for parking is so big that we use more land in this country for storing each car than we do for housing each person. So let's think through some of the effects that this has on the city. What about the type of urbanism that we get? As a result of these constraints, this requirement to provide all this parking, we have stopped building, as a society, small buildings. Parking requirements have triggered an extinction-level event for the type of bite-sized infill apartment buildings, like row houses, brownstones, triple-deckers. The production of buildings with 2 to 4 units fell more than 90% in the United States between 1971 and 2021. Developers have instead gravitated either towards larger projects, which you see on the right, because they can justify the expense of a structured garage, or towards sprawl, which you see on the left, where the land is cheap enough for a 3-car garage or a surface parking lot. They have also gravitated towards higher cost units to pay off the expense of the parking, and they've gravitated towards apartment units with fewer bedrooms. Because when bedrooms are linked to the number of parking spaces, as they are in many jurisdictions, it pays off to build smaller apartments rather than family-sized apartments. So to give you a photographic illustration of this trend, it looks like this in Cincinnati. Our laws limit housing and they require parking, and as a result, we have a parking surplus and a housing shortage. But let's zero in on this question of architecture, because a second consequence of making the parking spot as mandatory as the front door has been in architecture. Increasing quantities of required parking have forced developers to move from this early 20th century vernacular, the one that characterizes most of cities like Philadelphia, corner taverns, storefront groceries, shops, and retail on the bottom floor of buildings that have housing and offices on top, to fast food chains, big box stores, and houses whose primary architectural feature is the front door, the garage door. The American architect Louis Sullivan said form followed function, but parking scholar Don Shoup says form follows parking requirements. And the system has made it impossible to maintain the traditional American Main Street. Central parcels that were originally developed as commercial storefronts facing the sidewalk, with offices or even housing above, these were what made up Main Street. What you see on the upper left here. Put 20 or 30 of them side by side, and there you go. But if you wanted to open a drugstore or a florist in a mainline town today, you'd need to provide a parking spot for every 250 square feet of interior space. More than half your lot is parking now. And if you want to build a 2-story shop, 3/4 of your land becomes parking, a totem in a field of asphalt. And so small towns in Pennsylvania that require 2 parking spots with every single unit of housing, well, if you want to build some affordable multifamily housing there, you're going to have to tear down everything around you just to build room for the parking. Or better yet, and perhaps by design, you won't be building that housing at all. Because this law also makes it impossible to renovate historic structures. One architect described buildings in her town as locked up behind a parking padlock, meaning without enough parking to be given new life. I don't think planners meant to make Main Street extinct when they passed these laws, but sometimes you don't know what you got till it's gone. Which brings me to a third consequence of the post-war parking status quo, which is transportation. Because all this parking is a dish that only makes us hungry for more parking. Parking forces us to drive more, and the more we drive, the more parking we crave. In the early days, certainly, parking arose in response to demand. But later, disappointing the planners who decided to require this parking, those very parking spaces began to create demand. Study after study has confirmed this cause and effect level relationship between parking and driving, between car ownership and parking at the level of homes, offices, or commercial districts. And it's not hard to see why, because free parking is a huge incentive. You pay for it whether you drive or not. It's a subsidy given out to drivers in this country in the form of free parking, and it runs into the hundreds of billions of dollars every year, just for all that land. And parking changes our transportation habits in another way, which I'm sure you've all experienced yourselves. It degrades the urban environment to the extent that walking, biking, or using transit becomes difficult or dangerous, because buildings that repel each other like magnets of the same pole are hard to walk between. Driveways cut up the sidewalk, and nobody likes walking through parking lots. Americans think they are deciding how to get around for themselves, but parking has its finger on the scales. And then finally, after housing affordability, architecture, urbanism, and transportation, our parking decisions have had a terrible effect on our environment and on public health. There are the carbon emissions from all the driving, which have helped make transportation the country's #1 source of greenhouse gas emissions. There is the local particulate pollution from car exhaust. I don't need to tell you about stormwater flooding during heavy rain. We've seen plenty of that recently in this country. And that's in part because of all the impervious surface that seals up natural land beneath asphalt and concrete. For the same reason, we have a lack of groundwater replenishment in the American West. And then parking is a huge contributor to the urban heat island effect. And obviously a hostile environment for birds and bugs. The production of concrete and asphalt uses huge amounts of materials and energy, and the sedentary lifestyles created by environments where the most basic human activity, walking from A to B, has been rendered nearly impossible. By consigning so much of our most valuable land to one use and one use only, the free storage of private automobiles, we have so thoroughly foreclosed the prospect of a rich public life, it can be hard to even imagine what we've lost. But this is the part where I tell you not to despair. I know it sounds bad, what I've laid out so far, but things are changing for the better. You may know the story of the monkey's paw, where a man gets 3 wishes and he wishes on the monkey's paw and they come true in the most awful way possible. Well, something similar happened to me a few years ago, and I was working on this book and I was thinking about how great it would be if people could share my epiphany that all this land currently being used for parking could be used for something else. If only society could come to that realization. And then boom, spring 2020 rolls around, and look what people started doing. City planners, restaurants, the public, everybody simultaneously came to this realization that all this parking that had previously been considered essential to small business survival actually wasn't quite so necessary. Seating areas blossomed in parking lots and curb spaces, and I remember what it was like. The Overton window had shifted. In New York, where I'm from, this was the biggest change to the streetscape in generations. And it took 6,000 parking spaces out of 3 million, which is to say, it took a tiny percentage of the city's parking stock to create this seismic change in the urban landscape. And this moment, when all these restaurants gave up this parking that had previously been thought essential to their business, revealed something. The demand for parking is not fixed, but flexible. And for a moment, you could begin to imagine what else we might do with all this land. So many towns and even a few states have now realized it does not make sense to require parking of new homes or new businesses or new shops. What happens when they get rid of those rules? When I set out to write this book, just 2 U.S. cities, Hartford, Connecticut, and Buffalo, New York, had decided to get rid of these rules. But over the past 5 years, this reform has caught fire. Many cities have gotten rid of zoning for parking entirely, and many others, including Philadelphia, have allowed businesses and shops and offices to decide how much parking to build in certain neighborhoods. So now we're beginning to see, is all this parking simply the result of preference, a nation of drivers manifesting their priorities in the environment, or has it been jammed into the urban environment by the force of law? With a few experiments under our belt, we can say for sure that these laws did force builders to build more parking than the market actually wanted, to pour billions of dollars in concrete for parking that will never be used, perpetuating a cycle of traffic and parking. For an example, let's look at Seattle. After the city let developers decide how much parking to build, they mostly did build parking. No surprise, it's America after all. But between 2012 and 2017, they built 18,000 fewer spaces than the old laws would have required. 18,000 fewer spaces. At the going rate of a Seattle parking garage, that's a savings in $500 million in unbuilt parking in one city over 5 years. And it's not just that the housing gets cheaper. Different types of housing become possible. When Miami relaxed parking minimums a few years ago, small townhouse developments began to crop up in the city's core neighborhood. Tempe, Arizona has a project with no parking at all. It's probably the first time housing without parking has been built in the Phoenix area in decades. In Los Angeles, planners decided to allow parking, buildings without parking in adaptive reuse. So historic structures could be renovated, and Los Angeles downtown saw 6,000 new apartments in these old early 20th century skyscrapers that had previously been abandoned. More apartments downtown than had been built in the previous 3 decades combined. Furthermore, when California stopped requiring accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, to include their own parking spaces, tens of thousands of garages were converted into granny flats and backyard cottages for seniors and singles. And this isn't just about architecture. This is also about who lives in the neighborhood. And taking these neighborhoods composed exclusively of single-family homes built for nuclear families in the middle of the 20th century and making them accessible for people who don't fit that mold. Furthermore, this is not just true in walkable city cores. When I was reporting this book, I talked to an office developer named David Cunningham, who has a firm that owns millions of square feet in the Sun Belt, cities like Dallas, Houston, Atlanta. And he actually counted how much of his parking was full, and he found his garages were never more than half occupied. And he had spent, this one guy at one firm, $100 million on empty parking spaces. So now he assigns fewer parking spaces to each tenant, and he builds less parking overall. So Philadelphia, which has already enacted a reform of this type, you are getting something that looks like what you see here on the left. Whereas this is an office building in Texas. This is what we call a parking podium building, where the first 11 floors plus 5 in the basement are all parking, and the office is perched on top. And spatially, this is pretty much the norm in terms of how much space gets allocated for parking versus other uses. So, what happens to the drivers? Are we moving back into a world of pre-war parking chaos? It turns out the answer is no, not yet. The drivers are fine, and that's in part because we have to work through our excess parking before we come close to a shortage. I think people tend to exaggerate when they think about how scarce parking is becoming. For example, I know people in Philadelphia complain about this all the time, so I read a Philadelphia Magazine article which reported that the net reduction in parking across Center City between 2015 and 2020 was just 500 spaces out of a total inventory of 46,000, or a cut of roughly 1%. But it's not just about working through excess parking. It's also because if we reorient our municipal policy away from building more parking, we can make decisions that in turn reduce the demand for parking. And instead of focusing on the supply of parking, like our mid-century peers, we can focus on demand. Trying to build your way out of a parking shortage, whether at the level of a neighborhood or an institution or a city, has enormous costs and often creates new demand to fill up those spots the moments they appear. So if there's one thing that I hope you take away from this, it's this. Demand for parking is more elastic than planners believed when they wrote those rigid parking codes. How many cars each household buys, how often they drive them, all this depends on how much parking you build and how much you charge for it. People who have less parking own fewer cars and drive less. As this same chief of staff in Chicago put it to me, if your number one concern is traffic, as many people do complain about at meetings, and your number one request is parking, you have to understand that those two things are at cross purposes. Here's an example of this. This is Seaside, Florida. It's famous for its tight-knit, anti-sprawl design, but it also does a good job with parking. Most people park their cars at the curb, and so the houses don't have this blank-faced wall of garage door. The streets are narrow and paved with brick and lined with big trees and parked cars, which makes drivers go slow. And that in turn makes the streets feel comfortable for parents with strollers or kids on bicycles. Furthermore, the businesses downtown aren't required to have their own parking. Instead, they share parking, which reduces operating costs, gets customers out on foot, and preserves the district's walkable feel. But Seaside's Achilles heel, with respect to parking, was that for a long time, all their public parking was free. The town square, which you see here, was essentially a giant parking lot. And that meant that people would circle round and round in their giant SUVs, waiting for a spot, creating traffic jams, and parents had to keep a close eye on their kids. During COVID, however, Seaside was all but empty, and that parking lot was turned into a plaza. People loved it. Andres Duani, one of the town planners, told me he had always hated this central square. But after the cars were moved out, he said, it was like Cinderella. Kids playing soccer, older people riding tricycles, cafe tables spilling out into the plaza. And even after visitors returned to Seaside, the town decided to keep that parking lot a plaza. And that was possible because they started charging for the rest of their parking, ensuring that there would always be a space available at the right price. Seaside's parking demand was more flexible than the parking codes had anticipated. Families with teenagers everyone used to drive in their own car to come to Seaside. And now they came in one car. And furthermore, visitors who wanted to go to the beach just parked further away for free. Others came to town in their bicycles, which was nicer because there was less traffic than before. Now, this transformation depends on a technology that was invented almost 100 years ago. Too often, contemporary city residents forget the purpose of the parking meter. It was not to sock it to the driver, but to manage and to organize this precious interface between streets and buildings, to sort drivers according to how long they needed to park and how much they wanted to pay. Because when parking is free, as it is in many small towns, the best parking spots are always taken up by the employees of downtown businesses. They park for free first thing in the morning, and they stay there all day. And when clients show up trying to find a space, they find there's no parking available. With parking meters, instead of everybody competing for the same 40 spots on Main Street, long-term parkers pay less or nothing and park further away or in garages and walk more, while short-term parkers pay more, park in front of their destination, and walk less. Now, getting this right has never been more crucial, because it is precisely the places where parking is difficult, genuinely difficult, cities like this one, where it's possible to live a satisfying car-free life. And make no mistake, as zoning for parking vanishes from city codes like it has here in Philadelphia, easing the way for infill housing, affordable housing, walkable retail, and so on, demand on the curb will increase. There are two sources of this pressure. First, long-neglected curbside real estate is suddenly in high demand for everything besides long-term car storage. In this category, we might put food deliveries, food trucks, ice cream trucks, taco trucks, taxis, but also non-curb uses, non-car uses of the lane, like bus lanes, bike lanes, pedestrian safety improvements, green space, restaurant patios, public space. And all of this is to say nothing of the challenge posed by electrification infrastructure. All of these uses are more valuable in social, environmental, or financial terms than parking. And just to put a crude figure on it, the city of Philadelphia estimated that with its streetery program, each restaurant that had a parking space dedicated to tables outside of it was generating $50,000 in revenue for one parking space every year, enough to create a new job. Secondly, as cities begin to build more housing with less parking and rising real estate values claim parking lots, they will have to contend with spillover parking and its discontents. Now, both of these projects, the reclamation of the public right-of-way and the revival of traditional urban forms, are very exciting. But they are also dependent on our ability to manage backlash, to manage parking and avoid this backlash that starts and quashes this virtuous cycle of walkable urbanism before it can start. Parking is the third rail of local politics. We know this, but that's because the third rail is where the power is. Now, the good news is we have a lot of technology we can deploy in place of the old parking meter. We can change the price we charge at the curb based on demand or trip purpose or vehicle size or the time of day. We can charge different prices for locals and tourists. We can choose how to spend that money on transit service or street trees or garages. We can rethink the structure of parking fines, charging more to frequent offenders or high-income drivers. We can automate parking enforcement with pay-by-plate technology, and we can reserve curb space for priority users, like people with disabilities or delivery trucks. We have new information about how parking is used, by whom, and for how long. And we have new ways to buy parking, reserve parking, share parking, and lease out unused spaces. We can let people block their own driveways to make better use of our curves. We can require employers to stop subsidizing employee parking or let landlords unbundle parking from their leases. We can change the way we distribute parking permits, grandfathering in existing privileges while letting new residents pay the market price for storing their private property in the public right-of-way. It used to be said that while any Fleabag motel owner knew exactly which rooms he rented and for how much, your average city, business, or landlord was totally in the dark about how much parking they used or needed. But that should not be the case anymore. Since I published this parking book last year, I've spoken with politicians and planners in a dozen cities about their own parking problems. And I have a technical analysis of what's going on. Looks kind of like this. You guys know the trolley problem? Trolley's coming down the track. On its current track, it's going to run over a bunch of people. You are at the switch, and you have the opportunity to pull that switch, put that trolley on a better track. a less deadly track. But by doing this, you take responsibility for that change. And I think in all of these cities, from Boston to Santa Fe to Orlando to Rochester, Minnesota, there is widespread acknowledgement that our current development paradigm is not good. That's the bottom track here. But there is also a fear that any change to the status quo might provoke a parking fight. That's the top track. And it's the responsibility of elected officials to make this shift in perilous parking politics. And the fear of provoking a backlash is holding them back from making this decision that many of them know is the right thing to do. Furthermore, the stakes of managing the curb correctly this time are high, because we need to avoid the parking chaos that set this cycle of parking, driving, and car-dependent land use in motion a century ago. And there are two things that are happening right now at this moment that make it particularly urgent. One is the adoption of electric vehicles. The Biden administration wants half of all new cars sold in the United States by 2030 to be electric. Electric vehicles need to be charged in a city like Philadelphia or Boston or New York, or San Francisco or Los Angeles, where people park at the curb. We're going to need to figure out a solution so that people in cities don't get left out of the EV transition. The EV industry calls these people garage orphans, which is kind of a term I don't love, but I think you should know that that's how they feel about us. And but it is a real challenge, right? To think about how we're going to install this infrastructure. And think about the mistakes we made at the middle of the 20th century in overbuilding parking. If we redo that with EV infrastructure, it's going to be a very costly mistake, simply because this infrastructure is so expensive. And then simultaneously, there is the potential arrival of autonomous vehicles, right? And this poses the possibility that suddenly these central lots and garages that have been thought so essential for city survival will lose all their value, because there will be no reason to park in a prime location, because your car can simply drive away after leaving you at the office or at school and park in a less valuable place. There we go. So this is an artist's representation of me talking to you. And you may be saying, look, we know all this. Look at Philadelphia. We got rid of the parking and neighborhoods asked for it back. We replaced parking spots with restaurant patios and the city dismantled them. I mean, hell, this is the town that gave us A&E's reality show Parking Wars, which for those of you who are new to this subject, represents a compelling place to continue your studies. If not of parking, then of human nature generally. So I want to introduce here some strategies to diffuse the politics here, because I think that is one of the major barriers to making progress. One is the Week Without Driving, which is this week, which is a relatively new national event that challenges people who typically drive everywhere to try and get around without driving. And I think this is particularly effective for politicians, including politicians who make decisions about our streets and our transit systems, but who might not regularly ride them, and help them see exactly what needs to be done to make these services more attractive and more usable for the people who do use them. And in fact, in California, it was precisely getting a state senator on his bicycle that convinced him that California had too much parking and needed to change their laws. I also want to bring up Boulder, Colorado, because Boulder, Colorado has seen a tremendous decline in the number of people driving to work alone, which you see here on this chart. That's in part because they have a parking benefit district downtown where they charge for parking, and they use that money raised by charging for parking to buy free bus passes for every employee in the downtown district, which further encourages people not to drive there. Perhaps more relevant to Philadelphia is Vancouver, Canada, which has two prices for parking permits. They have the market rate and the legacy rate. And so if you've lived in Vancouver for years, you pay a lower price to park on the street than you do if you just moved to town. And people sometimes ask me, what is going to take away this fervent desire people feel over parking? And to be honest, I don't know the answer, but I know that when it comes, you have to get people when they make new decisions in their life. Big changes like moving to a new city. where you can take away parking privileges without rocking the boat too much. Then there's Everett, Massachusetts, which is near me. They used to get developments like the one you see here on the left, which meant that they were losing all their ground floor retail in their downtown, and they stopped requiring parking, and now they only distribute parking stickers that correspond to the curb frontage of each of these buildings, so that they make sure they're not overloading their streets. And now they get buildings like the one on the right, which is going to be 125 units of affordable housing. It was supposed to be a parking garage. Oops. Well, let's leave it here. So I'm coming to you from Boston. Boston, as you know, has a serious housing affordability problem. And one of the reasons for that is we build more parking than we build housing. One of the results of this is that the city is losing population. And if you don't build that housing near commuter rail stations, near subway stations, in the downtown core, you get the housing out here, where people have to drive 30 miles every day, contributing to the city's traffic problems. And this is if you're lucky, because it's probably more likely that those people move to Arizona or Texas or Florida. And because of the magic of Google Street View, I can see what used to be on this plot before these houses were built, which is virgin New England forest. Now, I want to argue that basically that parking and traffic are actually some of the motivating factors behind NIMBY politics. And that seems discouraging on the one hand, but it also means that we can solve this problem of people not wanting new neighbors with a correct approach to the parking problem. And because it's October, I want to talk briefly about politics, and just to say that if we can't figure out this parking problem, if we can't figure out how to get our cities beyond this point where we've reached at the limit of car dependency, where it seems we can't build any more housing without creating intractable traffic and parking problems, we are forfeiting our own political influence in high-cost states in the Northeast and the Midwest. And I know it might not seem that way, because in Pennsylvania you're being bombarded with political advertisements every time you turn on the television, but this is a redistricting map, a congressional reapportionment for 2030. And you can see states like New York, California, losing representation. So our inability to build this housing, which is tied to our inability to manage parking, is actually changing our national politics through our reshaping of our population geography. So here's a graphic that I drew. And what I hope this illustrates to you is that at some point it gets easier, because there's also a virtuous cycle. If we could take some of this parking and we could do something else with it, there would be so many more things: schools, cafes, gyms, parks, stores within walking distance. Now, Philadelphia has been on the cutting edge of this trend with developments like this, which I have yet to see anywhere else, to be honest. But if we get this right, we can unleash safe streets, transportation alternatives, housing near jobs and amenities that permit growth without additional demands on the parking supply. New neighbors without new traffic. We have to build bike lanes because nobody should die riding a bicycle. And this is especially important at a moment when electric bicycles are unlocking this form of low-carbon, low-cost mobility for a much larger group of people. We can build bus lanes so that commuters have an incentive to leave the car at home. We can build bump outs around crosswalks to preserve the sight lines for drivers and make intersections safer for pedestrians. We can plant trees, shade the street, and restore patches of native grassland, which will draw in bugs and birds, clean and cool the air, and soak up stormwater before it floods people's houses. And all of these examples only require a little bit of street parking. Most parking is in parcels that can be developed into new buildings. If we get this right, we can stop the NIMBYism of Americans who see their new neighbors as first and foremost a threat to their parking spaces. We can unlock new housing types so that seniors can age in place and young adults can move out of their parents' houses. We can build an environment where people with disabilities who don't drive, and most of them don't, can navigate life's needs independently. Because with better parking policy, we can restore a sense of choice to both housing and transportation in this country, where for far too long there has been only one thing on the menu. Parking subsidy is nice, but car dependency is a tax. forces most Americans to put a rising share of their income into purchasing, fueling, and maintaining 2.2 automobiles per household per year. Cars are amazing, and they represent freedom for many of us, but the inability to get around any other way is a kind of prison. Half of all trips in the United States are under 3 miles, and so change is possible, even without a Tokyo-quality mass transit system. The promise of this reform is not to punish drivers, but to liberate them. Because without parking baked into our streets and our architecture, how many more people could live in walkable places? How many car-dependent places freed from parking law could grow into neighborhoods where people could ride bikes, where a family with 3 cars could get by with just 2, or a family with 2 cars could manage with just 1. And in that world, it would be easier, not harder, to find a spot, and much easier to live in a place where you would not need to drive quite so often. Kids could walk to school, and adults to the grocery store. In a world with better parking, there might be fewer places to park. But in place of those old parking spots would emerge a city so much richer and fuller and fairer that we would not think twice about what had been lost. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right. I'm sure there are some questions and comments, a lot to think about there, a lot of great images and good stats. So we have microphones. As you know, we're recording this for the future. So we request that you ask your questions into the microphones. Lisa and Ulrika have microphones. They'll come to you. You can come to them. Let's have at it.
Hi, thank you. Curious if you've seen any trends around generational shifts. I'm thinking of data I saw Jeanette Sadi-Khan present years ago about when they accessed taxi information to be able to see where people are actually traveling. And now you have generation that's come up used to things like Uber and Lyft and taxis and other sort of, I don't have to own the vehicle, travel. Plus fewer Gen Z getting licenses or getting them much later in life. So, I mean, data is historic, but what projections, if any, have you seen about that impact on parking?
It's a great question. I feel like speaking to an auditorium with so many Gen Z people in it, it would be unwise to try and make bold predictions about generational change, generational habits. But one thing I can say with confidence is that for people of my generation and younger, the housing affordability crisis in this country is so intense that it has begun to feel to me that there is no alternative but to figure out a way to build more housing. And that is why I think parking is so important. I showed this graph very briefly about the reasons people say no to housing in their neighborhood. You can see an overwhelming majority say traffic and parking is their number one concern. And that's why I think it's important to get this right, because I think people, we need the houses, right? I mean, you saw Barack Obama, Kamala Harris, the Democrats are talking about this as their major campaign issue to address the cost of living in this country. And I don't think that's an accident, right? We understand that for a lot of people, it feels like home ownership is an opportunity that was only available to their parents and that it isn't possible today. Now, I think the good news about this is that it presents an opportunity, because a lot of the time people say, well, okay, you got your Philadelphia, San Francisco, New York, your cities where people actually can live without a car. But then you have places where that's really not possible, like Austin, Texas, or San Jose, California. What's interesting is Austin and San Jose are the 2 largest cities to have gotten rid of their parking requirements. So they're now beginning to see all this infill development that's being built with a lot less parking than before. And so I think, to some extent, the flip side of the housing shortage is the possibility of taking all these sprawling, low-density places and building enough infill housing development to provide a density of people and to support a density of amenities, right? So you get enough people there that suddenly transit becomes workable. Someone can open up a cafe or a grocery store, right? I think all that is possible if we make it possible to build the housing that we need.
More questions? Come on, guys.
Josh.
Hi, I just had a question about using information as a way of charging certain rates for parking. I was just wondering how feasible you think that is, because you were talking about also using potentially like for high income people charging higher, or if they're out of town or something. So how do you think we could build a system to use information? Do you think people would consent to something like that?
Well, the politics of it are complicated. Paris recently passed a policy that charges a very high rate to SUVs. And they got a lot of publicity for this because people thought, well, this is something that would be attractive in America, where SUVs both take up literally more room in parking, so maybe they should pay more, but also they impose costs on everybody else on the street because it's so much more dangerous for pedestrians than sedans. So to the extent that a city can discourage people from driving in their giant trucks and SUVs, the city would want to do that. But the reason this works in Paris is because they're only charging this rate to out-of-towners with SUVs. And so I think this is as much a statement about inside the walls and outside the walls as it is about SUVs versus cars, which is just to say that the politics of this are quite challenging. But again, the technology to do this is so new that I feel like we've barely even scratched the surface of what's possible. I mean, I think you could start by thinking about parking fines and equity. And for example, I think it would make a lot of sense to have parking fines be staggered based on how many parking fines somebody has gotten and on their ability to pay, right? To make this proportional, right? So you don't want anybody getting trapped in a cycle of revenue-driven policing where they get their car impounded and then they can't go to work because they've lost their car and then they lose their job and so on, right? And that's a real risk. That happens in places. And I think it's a reminder that parking policy at the street level is about organizing the curb. It's not about raising money. It's about organization, and it's about managing this precious and limited resource. So this is all very new. So I don't have a ton of examples to give you, but I think the possibilities are basically endless. Like we could charge at the curb based on any number of attributes, and I would love to see a city start experimenting with those.
And I want to add to that, I'm German, and in Germany, a lot of the large cities started just increasing their parking fees tremendously. And what they reached with that was really like, okay, the people who live there usually have parking, but people coming into the city would think twice if they pay for parking or use public transport. And obviously, if you have more people using public transport, you will have a better network of public transport. So it's really a little bit of a catch-22. And if you look at old cities, like European cities, Asian cities, and so on, they usually pre-exist the car. And somehow people manage to figure it out there as well. So should let Americans think about it a little bit more. More questions? Yes.
Really compelling lecture. Thank you. One thing, I don't know if you got into it in your research or in your book at all, but I was curious about parking as a business. I guess that's probably, parking garages and street level parking. We talk about, or often we think about some bad policies, often are the result of like large lobbying efforts. Is there any such thing with parking? Is there political pressure? Like you framed it as, largely coming out of the growth of having cars in cities. But is there any political pressure, applied that also keeps any of these policies in place?
That's a great question. Thank you. Yeah, I think parking is actually one of the rare industries that actually does not have very much power. If you talk to parking garage owners in Philadelphia, they will tell you that they are constantly being beaten down by the city. Like the tax on parking in Philadelphia is something like 20 to 30%, I think, which obviously if that were a sales tax on regular products, it would never fly. But they're able to do it because parking is considered a nuisance use, right? So I think the most powerful lobby that has defended the parking status quo is basically AAA, right? It's the everyday drivers of America, similar to explaining housing politics in many ways, right? It's just there's an overwhelming number of people who drive and think they're entitled to this space. But I think there's also a way around that. I mean, there's a lot of cities where lots and lots of people, and particularly low-income people, don't own cars and use transit. And so there is a sort of, I think there is a challenging question is the American urban environment, suburban houses, white picket fences, lawns, et cetera, what we actually want as a country? I think most people probably do want that. But there is a minority that has been underserved historically by the products that are on the market. For example, for 50 years, it was illegal and impossible to buy a housing unit without a parking space, right? And so there's a whole part of the market that's missing there. And I think as we think about this going forward, a lot of this is about putting those options back in place. It's about restoring this kind of choice, both in driving and in transportation and in housing. And I don't think so the answer to your question is, there's not really a powerful lobby to overcome, but that's not to say the political resistance is not real.
Hi. Thank you for the great lecture. I just was curious to, thinking about like sort of this adaptive reuse of like parking once we kind of dispose of it and like replace it with things. Then comes sort of the next symptom of like urban sprawl and car dependency, which is the highway, which, you see it here, especially like what happened to Chinatown and around, that time of urban renewal. You also see it in places like Houston or LA where the highways sort of, cut up the city. Are you aware of any like precedent or plans for sort of addressing highways next, or perhaps finding a solution to those next? Or, what's the future of like highways once parking is defeated?
There are cities, right, over the last 5 years that have begun to reclaim underused urban highways that were plowed through often black neighborhoods in major cities in the 1950s. And there is a process underway to turn those back into cityscapes, right, to restore them as urban boulevards with housing alongside, et cetera, and rebuild those neighborhoods. I think the thing that's difficult about highways is that they represent massive pieces of infrastructure. They took decades to build, and they'll probably take decades to unbuild, right? And the beautiful thing about parking from a city planning perspective is you can mess with it overnight, right? You can, San Francisco decided they were going to charge more for street parking than they charge for garage parking because everybody would rather park on the street than in a garage. And so they tried to adjust the prices to make them accommodate that preference, right? To encourage long-term parkers to go straight into the garage rather than driving around the block. And that's an example of a change that can be instituted pretty much overnight, which is very unusual in city politics, where it seems like you have to wait years and years to do anything. So I think that is one of the reasons that a lot of this reform is happening. It's because it's so easy to mess with. And I think highways, it is a great project, but it took us a century to build them, and it would probably take us a century to unbuild them.
Hi, I really liked your talk. I thought it was really interesting, and your thesis is super compelling. I wanted to hear your thoughts on automated parking. I just had a lunch and learn today about automated parking, and I think it's interesting that developers can triple the amount of housing units that they have because they can also triple the amount of parking spaces that they have. And I'm also hearing that automated parking spaces are becoming kind of comparable in price to just a regular parking garage spot. It's like $40,000 per spot, where a regular parking garage spot is like $25,000 or $30,000. So as these numbers start to get kind of closer together, I just want to hear what you think about creating more parking spaces, even though it's in a smaller amount of space.
You're talking, just to be clear, you're talking about like a mechanical system that grabs your car and puts it in a slot and then brings it up back to you when you're ready for it, right?
Yeah, so no person necessary.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting. I hadn't heard that the price of that was coming down. I mean, often these systems are great, but they only exist in super luxury buildings because it costs so much to build, and most people just don't think it's worth it, and they'd rather just park their car. I think that's very interesting, although I think it presents one of the same challenges as autonomous vehicles. Autonomous vehicles could hypothetically park much more efficiently than our cars, right? Because nobody needs to open a door. Nobody does a bad parking job, right? You don't need a valet. You could potentially pack, twice as many cars into the same garage with AVs. But then the question becomes, do you want all those cars on the street? And so if you're a city and you're approving an apartment building, do you want an automated parking system where you're going to end up with twice as many cars as you would have otherwise? And so I think that's a difficult public policy decision for cities going forward, since while parking is often an amenity that people want with their units, all that driving also imposes a very real social cost on people who use the street in terms of pollution and accidents and everything else, and traffic. I think the big question for cities going forward is how to regulate that. And you are seeing cities now, even before the real arrival of this low-cost automated system, that are saying we want to have maximums, so that we don't actually want developers to be able to build as much parking as they want. Not only do we not want to force them to build it, but we want to cap how much they build. And I think that's interesting because it shows it's almost a way to build affordability into the system, since most high-end luxury apartments are expected to come with 2 parking spaces. If you can sort of limit the number of parking spaces, you're forcing developers to shoot for a slightly lower tier on the market than they would be going for otherwise. But it's a great question, complicated, worth keeping an eye on, I think.
Hi, thank you for your lecture. I just wanted to ask, and this is specifically regarding city parking and parking on the streets. You mentioned that more cities are going towards paid parking and such, and so it's lowering traffic. But do you think that in a couple of years maybe people might start complaining about paying for parking instead of having the free parking?
Always. People have been complaining about paying for parking since the dawn of time, since the dawn of the parking meter anyway. And I think actually the trend in American cities has been in large part to get rid of paid parking and to replace paid parking with acres and acres of parking lots, tearing down buildings to make that possible. And I think to the extent that paid parking is now making a comeback, it's because our cities are densifying, there's more and more construction, and there's a realization that this is a limited resource and it needs to be managed. The people who oppose this are often local business owners, and you have to get around to convincing them, which has happened in many cities, that in fact the thing that their clients want is not free parking, it's available parking. And to go back to that graph of the trilemma that I showed you earlier, the Venn diagram, it's very hard for the parking to be convenient, available, and free. And for a local business owner, it's actually better that the parking be convenient and available for their clients than it is for it to be convenient and free, but not available. And paying for parking makes that possible. And I think many businesses have come around to the idea that that makes sense, especially because in a lot of places, and this is especially true in small towns, there's often a bit of free parking just a couple blocks away. And so you really just need to push those all-day parkers a little bit further away, and paid parking is really the only way to do that.
Hi, thank you. Great lecture. I really enjoyed it. So I have been working in rural Caribbean islands. And so on my most recent trip, I noticed a lot of highway building, the first large mall with a large paved parking lot, a lot of water runoff problems, and looking at the small rural towns that will be impacted by this new highway system. And there are plans for 350 people per bedrooms per hectare, I guess. in a lot of these areas. So it's a crisis that's happening as I'm watching it. So what's the dialogue between people like you who are hugely invested and working very well in existing cities, managing their problems? Philly's a case study for all things good and bad in urban planning. I'm thinking of Ed Bacon's South Street Highway project, which divided the city for decades. But this is a situation where these neighborhoods are just going to be completely destroyed without infrastructure. And I'm just wondering if it's something you've seen in your travels.
It's a great question. I mean, to some extent, we have exported the American model of urban development to much of the developing world, and there is an expectation that to attain a certain level of status and wealth means having a single-family home and an SUV. And in parts of the world that are still developing, that is going to require enormous amounts of energy and land to make that possible. So one of the challenges here is in these developing world cities that are growing super rapidly is to build in the systems now that will make it so this type of development doesn't happen on the scale that it has happened in the United States. Because once it's done, it's very hard to undo. And this is why, I think, in the United States right now, as we confront this housing affordability crisis and we begin to remedy it, it's crucial that those units get built in walkable neighborhoods in the center of cities where people are less likely to drive 30 miles every day and less likely to have their houses pushed into zones where they'll be more vulnerable to natural disasters. Because that's what you're seeing in California, right? You're seeing people priced out of these coastal, cool, temperate districts along the ocean and pushed into wildfire zones in the interior of the state. And so I think, again, that's why it's crucial to get this right. I think one thing the developing world has going for it, paradoxically, is the American freeway interstate program required an enormous amount of money, right? You'd want to talk about like social engineering. There is no greater government social engineering project than this moonshot that was the interstate highway system. They made all this suburban sprawl possible. And when I've been to places like Sao Paulo or Cairo, I don't see that happening, or Algiers, right? They're not going to be able to afford to build those systems. So sprawl can get built, but unless it comes with these highway systems that we've been able to build in America, it's not really going to work for those people. And so I think to some extent they may be forced to find better solutions just because the American solution that we came up with was so expensive. Not just in its costs that it imposed on all of us, which I've talked about today, but literally in dollar terms. So we do have that going for us. But big question, maybe subject of another lecture. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Henry. That was great. Thank you, everyone. Anyone who would like to donate a little bit of cash, who's got some extra cash laying around, these lectures cost money and we're always wanting to make them bigger and better. So you're welcome to scan that. Students, you're not expected to. Don't worry, you give us enough. But we hope you'll see you all here in January for our next talk. Thank you. Good night. And thanks again, Henry.